Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. A pleasant greeting to you. You are tuned in to the semifinals of the International Reparation Debate Competition for 2026. That's right, the semifinals. 36 teams registered for this competition. At this point in time, only four teams remain. These four teams stand at the pinnacle of this competition, and they'll be duking it out to see if they can make it all the way to Jamaica for the grand finals at the UWI Regional Headquarters on April 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Of course, none of this would have been possible without some really important people, sponsors, and partners. It is because of them why we've been able to expand the conversation of reparation, narrowing in on the perspective of our youth. And we want to take the opportunity to give them a hearty thank you. And so, of course, we want to express our gratitude to the University of the West Indies, the Center for Reparation Research, the UWI Press, Jade Limited, the University of Hull, and our main partners, the Repair Campaign. I am Ravon Thomas Matthews, and I will be serving as the chair judge for this match. And in fact, the panel for this match is the best panel that Jade can put together. This panel consists of myself, Ravon Thomas Matthews, one of the chief adjudicators for this competition, Jermaine Barrett, the other chief adjudicator for this competition, and finally, Mr. Matthew White, who is the deputy chief adjudicator for this competition. And of course, we have a wonderful guest judge. But before we get into all of that, I'd love for my judges to introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am so excited to be at this stage in the competition. It's a semifinals round. Big congratulations to all the teams who have advanced thus far. You are absolutely talented and amazing. Believe that, all right? I'm looking forward to an excellent match for today.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm so happy that I advanced. Yay. I'm also happy to be here with you this morning and adjudicate. I really wish that the best team wins.
Thank you very much. Of course, our guest judge for this match is none other than Dr. Chevy Eugene. He is one of the global top 100 most influential people of African descent in regards to politics and governance. And he has been here before and he has performed exceptionally, and we're very happy to have him back. Some greetings, please, Dr. Chevy Eugene.
Greetings, one and all. Thank you, Ravon, for the intro, and thank you for blessing me with this opportunity to be here again. As I mentioned earlier to the students who are debating, I'm thankful to be here, and I'm looking forward to hear the arguments. And what I will say in addition to that is just to see how the conversations of reparations is taking place across not just in the Caribbean but also in the diaspora. So it excites me, and I'm really looking forward to hear people's position. And as was mentioned earlier on, you are the final part of the final four of 36 groups of students. So congratulate yourself and good luck to you all. One love.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Dr. Chevy Eugene. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been hearing us talk a lot about these exceptional two teams. It's time for you to meet them once again. In proposition, we have the team coming out of the United Kingdom Rawlins Academy. At this point in time, we'd like to ask them to introduce themselves.
Good day, I'm Aisha Basari. I am the first speaker.
I'm Clara Byford, and I'm the second speaker.
I'm Edith Marshall, and I'm the third speaker.
Thank you.
Indeed. And of course, the team in opposition, Our Lady of Fatima College out of Trinidad and Tobago. Please introduce yourselves.
Hi, my name is Candy Valley. I'm the first speaker.
Hi, my name is Adam Alves. I'm the second speaker.
Hi, my name is David Scotland, and I'm the reply speaker, and good luck.
Thank you very much. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Your top 6 out of 12 debaters. The motion governing this round. This House believes that post colonial states should replace colonial languages with Creole and indigenous languages in official public domains. Once more, this House believes that post colonial states should replace colonial languages with Creole and indigenous languages in official public domains. Once more, for the penultimate time, the Jade parliamentary format will see the first speakers presenting for 7 minutes, the second speakers for 6 minutes, and the third and final speakers for 5 minutes. Of course, the first and last minute of the first two speeches are considered protected time, in which no points of information will be allowed. Outside of protected time, points of information are not only allowed, we absolutely encourage them. There will be no points of information allowed during the reply speeches. Unique to the Jade parliamentary format are two exciting periods of cross-examination. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those periods of cross-examination when we get to that part of the debate. And so, ladies and gentlemen, enough from me. It is time to bring to order this, the first match of the semi-finals of the International Reparation Debate Competition. We do so by inviting the first speaker from Rawlins Academy, Aisha Busari, to take the stage.
Good day, esteemed judges, timekeeper, and members of the opposition. This House believes that post-colonial states should replace colonial languages with Creoles and indigenous languages in official public domains. Replacing colonial languages is not just a linguistic choice. It is a transformation of identity and power, the way it gives strength materially and symbolically, a restructuring of education and opportunity, and a direct challenge to the dependence on neo-colonial systems that still shape the Caribbean today. I will start by explaining the material and symbolic benefits and effects on education and introduce our model. My second speaker will cover the dependence on former colonizers and the class system, and my third speaker will rebut, reiterate, and conclude. Now, I'd like to define one of our key terms. We define a Creole as a stable, fully developed natural language that originates from the blending of different languages, often a European colonial language and indigenous or African language. Our first argument in favor of the motion is that language reform produces both symbolic empowerment and tangible improvements in governance, culture, and development. To start symbolically, it restores cultural dignity after centuries of linguistic suppression. Language reform signals a break from colonial hierarchies, enabling true post-colonial autonomy. Indigenous language education fosters cultural pride and reduces stigma, the same stigma that is a byproduct of enslavement and white supremacy. It again allows people pride in these cultures that have been so strongly suppressed and demonized over the centuries. Legitimization also values these languages that have been seen as inferior due to racism. It disassembles this idea that the enslaved and their descendants are somehow less intelligent. This also links to neocolonialism, which my second speaker will elaborate on. Furthermore, when colonial languages are used in official public domains, it doesn't reflect the language of everyday people. Materially, to use indigenous languages would improve service delivery, governance efficiency, and civic engagement. It's proven that public health campaigns in indigenous languages achieve higher compliance and outreach, and indigenous languages encode local ecological and agricultural knowledge, improving environmental policy as the language matches the environment. Local language media industries would also grow, boosting creative economies and cultural production. And economically, governments would save money by reducing reliance on foreign textbooks, consultants, and translation services. Now I'd like to introduce our model. We do not propose an overnight change. We do not suggest we ban any speaking of colonial languages. What we do propose is a gradual, staggered change over the next 15 years, which allows Creoles and indigenous languages to move up the language hierarchy and to be used in public domains. Another key point is that we would allow for regional multilingualism, which means that regions would choose their own languages. And we allow the regions to make decisions rather than choosing one language for the whole thing. We suggest that the state will replace colonial languages, for example, English, Spanish, and Portuguese, with indigenous languages and Creoles, in official public domains, such as government administration, courts and legal systems, national documentation, like IDs, forms and laws, and public broadcasting, health communication, and education. To elaborate on public education, we believe the colonial languages would ideally still be learnt in secondary school by choice, and they could and would be used in global affairs, but everyday life must reflect the language of everyday people. This will be completed through the following mechanisms. Standardization, seen in Tanzania with Tanzania's National Kiswahili Council, which created legal and scientific terms. Teacher training in Ethiopia, which trained teachers to work in Somali. Curriculum reform, seen in Papua New Guinea, which produced top-pissing textbooks for primary
Point of
school.
information.
Accepted.
If you say regions choose which language they will use, isn't it likely that majorities will use their democratic power to choose the languages which support them and exclude minorities, the same way you say colonial language does?
No, we believe it will help include diversity and allow the thousands of indigenous languages and creoles to be used in actual laws. Although there is always a possibility of people abusing their powers, that's no reason to suppress the opinions of those who can't always do so. To continue, we'd like to introduce our timeline, which replicates the Tanzanian timeline. Years 1 to 3 would have the standardization of vocabulary, teacher training would begin, and bilingual government documents would be introduced. From years 4 to 7, primary education would fully transition, courts and ministries would adopt indigenous languages, and media and public health campaigns would switch. And from years 8 to 15, secondary education would transition fully, governments would adopt this fully, and translation bureaus would manage international affairs. Also, language replacement is not new, and as I've previously stated, we have seen places where it has worked out. Now I'd like to introduce our last argument, which is that mother tongue education dramatically improves learning outcomes, literacy, and long-term development. UNESCO and the World Bank show that children learn best in their first language, with higher comprehension and retention. Students taught in their mother tongue are 30 to 50 more likely to achieve basic literacy by age 10. Early education in colonial languages causes cognitive overload, reducing critical thinking and creativity. The Caribbean is also currently going through an education crisis. And for the reasons I will soon state of examples where implementing indigenous languages has helped improve education, we believe this could be the solution. Countries like Ethiopia and Tanzania show improved early years literacy when using indigenous languages. Mother tongue instruction reduces dropout rates and increases school attendance. Parents would also be able to support homework and learning when the language matches the home environment. Children develop stronger foundational skills, making it easier to learn additional languages later, which is why the colonial languages would become secondary, not primary. This is also why in our model we propose that indigenous languages would be learned in primary school while colonial languages learned in secondary, because if we build a strong foundation, then it would make it easier for them to obtain this information. Early education in indigenous languages creates a more equitable system, reducing long-term inequality. To conclude, due to symbolic and material benefits and potential improved education outcomes, as well as the examples I've said included both in our model and in my arguments, we believe that it's beneficial for the Caribbean to implement indigenous and languages and creoles to replace colonial languages. Thank you. The government now temporarily rests.
And thank you very much. That was the opening speech from the first speaker from Rawlins Academy, Aisha Busari. Ladies and gentlemen, we invite the first speaker from the team in opposition, Fatima College, to take the space. That is Kennedy Valley.
I will begin on my next word. Mr. Speaker, the modern world is not bounded by states, it is globalized, and we fundamentally oppose exclusion. We define official public domains as functions and services where the state interacts with citizens, including government communication, law, state media, public healthcare, and public education, in line with the proposition. But the proposition wants to have their cake and eat it too, by saying people can choose to use colonial language in education. We think that replace implies a complete substitution by definition, What they're describing is some sort of model of incorporation. And even so, this model has empirically failed in Tanzania, which they cite, where English is compulsory as an extra language in secondary school, but proficiency rates are still in the single digits. There is a necessary trade-off on colonial language proficiency in education. And also, this is important. On all their benefits of symbolic benefits, they assert that stigmas exist and incorporating Creole and indigenous languages will bring national pride and identity. But literally, they do not warrant this. Why would this happen when there's an economic incentive I will show for colonial languages in the status quo? I will bring two arguments. First, replacing colonial languages impedes international trade. Second, it entrenches economic inequality in a state. My second speaker will extend on loss of access to global resources. On to our first argument. I will prove a causal link showing that when you replace colonial languages, you phase out the public's proficiency in those languages, resulting in language barriers. And these barriers will make international trade more costly and less efficient, harming trade-reliant post-colonial economies. According to UE, the English-speaking Caribbean boasts adult literacy rates upwards of 85%. Accepted.
With your
Hello?
point about international trade, how would you contend the idea that nations like Japan and China have extremely low rates of English proficiency, yet are still some of the biggest players in international trade?
Well, this is largely untrue. In China, they have a huge TEFL, or teaching English as a foreign language market, which has millions of users, and they use that so that the people in business can gain an advantage. As I will show, when you remove English proficiency as a public good, it'll become privatized and elites will use it more. That's actually what happens in China. According to UE, English-speaking the Caribbean boasts adult literacy rates upwards of 85%. According to Statista, South Africa's English literacy rates are around 90%, and English literacy rates in many Indian states are above 80% and rising. So currently we are proficient. To begin with, when a state removes a colonial language from public education, future generations lose exposure and fluency. Linguist Monica S. Smith explains in her 2011 language attrition model that language follows a use it or lose it principle. This matters because public schooling reaches the overwhelming majority of students, over 80% of students in Africa and the Caribbean, according to the Journal of African Development and UE. Replacement of colonial languages in public education, therefore, removes the main pathway to learn these languages. This is evidenced again in Tanzania, where Kiswahili replaced English as the medium of public education in the 70s. What followed was a sharp and steady decline in English proficiency over time. You can't just choose to use the language. Therefore, this results in a loss of a common language with the colonial language-speaking world, creating a language barrier. These language barriers are not merely social, but have real economic consequences. According to the Journal of International Studies of Economics, a common language reduces transaction costs, accelerates communication, and builds stronger business relationships in international trade. This fact is compounded by a 2011 meta-analysis by the Royal Economic Society, which stated that sharing a language increases trade between two states by approximately 44%. Conversely, a 2004 Journal of Economic Literature study found that a language barrier has an equivalent impact to a 7% tax on trade. Now that we understand the sheer impact that losing colonial language has on our economies, allow me to demonstrate our vulnerability to that. Post-colonial states depend heavily on trade. According to CARICOM, the Caribbean imports up to 60% of its food, largely from the English-speaking United States, costing $6 billion annually. Furthermore, the World Bank reports that trade makes up nearly half of India's annual income and over half of South Africa's, with the US and UK as primary trade partners. The World Bank estimates that every 1% drop in a state's annual income pushes around 60,000 people into extreme poverty on average. With 3.2 million Caribbean citizens already facing food insecurity, according to the United Nations, higher prices could push many into hunger. With trade being essential to the economies of post-colonial countries, a drop of even 1% is detrimental to our already struggling citizens' decline. My second argument is that this policy entrenches elite advantage. A 2020 Harvard study showed that when states restrict access to economically valuable languages like English, wealthy elites use their resources to learn them anyway, creating what is called elite enclosure. This is proven in Tanzania. Despite Kiswahili public education, wealthy families attend English medium private schools, as shown in the Canadian Journal of African Studies. There's a strong economic advantage to colonial language. The World Bank notes that Caribbean tourism employs 3 million people, and UE finds that 80% of tourism jobs demand high English proficiency as a fundamental requirement of daily operations with foreigners. India's call center industry employs 2 million people, also requiring English to interact with international callers. The Chinese Finance Ministry reports learning English privately costs thousands of US dollars per month for citizens, which is prohibitively expensive for the average citizen, but the rich still do it. The impact is that language opportunities become privatized. The rich maintain access while the public is locked out, worsening inequality. Now, allow me to move to policy. Mr. Speaker, under the British Parliamentary and World Schools rules, when a motion says this House believes that X actor should do Y policy, the opposition is allowed to present a counter-proposal using the same or fewer resources. Therefore, all the funds the proposition would spend translating curricula, retraining teachers, and overhauling legal and healthcare systems into native languages, we'd invest in teacher training and literacy programs as seen in Singapore's Stellar Reading Initiative, which built competitive English proficiency while maintaining bilingualism. In law and healthcare, instead of full replacement, states should subsidize on-demand professional interpreters, as enshrined in US civil rights, ensuring language access to those who need it now while building long-term colonial language proficiency. Mr. Speaker, isolation from trade and privatizing global opportunity will never be the answer, especially when UNESCO has multiple programs like in the Peruvian Amazon to already preserve these languages. This is a radical policy we proudly oppose.
And thank you very much, Kennedy Valley, for that opening speech from Fatima College. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised you something exciting. I promised you a period of cross-examination. And we are at that point in the debate. So for the period of cross-examination, this will see the teams posing questions to each other. Opposition will pose their 3 questions first, and proposition will respond to those 3 questions. Each question will last no more than 10 seconds. Each answer will last no more than 45 seconds. Of note, for the team asking the question, only one person may do so at a time. But for the team answering the question, the entire team can chime in to provide a robust answer. After opposition has posed their 3 questions and they've been answered, we will give the same privilege to proposition to pose their 3 questions. With the rules out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, let's engage in the first period of cross-examination.
Can I be heard?
Loud and clear, ready when you are.
Okay, first question. Do you support the privatization of the advantages of colonial language to those with the resources to afford it?
No, we do not. As we stated, we have a 15-year plan, which would allow the education system to develop a strong English language program like that of many European states, which would make the Caribbean and its access to English as a second language more equitable.
Also, my second speaker will expand on this later.
Okay. In Ireland, Irish was officialized, yet stigmas largely remained. Why precisely would officializing languages remove stigmas when there's a huge economic incentive for colonial language?
Because when Ireland put Irish at the top of the linguistic hierarchy, they did very little else to actually put it in place. They didn't push, whereas you look at other countries which made it a law to have the language that they chose in, let's say, news, media, education, and this led to the discrimination that the society had and the view that society had of it erased.
And these stigmas come from the idea that the enslaved are somehow less intelligent, which is why these languages aren't valid. Making these the official language would disprove these stigmas.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Furthermore, the point about Ireland ignores Ireland's current political reality of being divided between a republic and the UK. The Caribbean has no part of it currently, which is under the direct control of an English-speaking nation.
Okay. Madam Prime Minister, in your model, you said that the people would choose the languages which they now speak. How does that prevent the majority from choosing the languages which support them, such as Africa, Swahili, and locking out minorities?
You see today that research has been done in the Caribbean on the language that is spoken. You see it today, you see that there is clear stats by world-leading organizations that tell us about what areas speak what languages in the majority. Also, we identify Creole as a separate language, as an individual language, as my first speaker defined it. Therefore, we would have these languages, and there is clear ways to find it and not lock out minorities.
Furthermore, and if one official language, which is usually the majority language, does not mean that other languages cannot be spoken. The majority of people in the Caribbean do not have English as a first language, with around 86% learning it as a second language, much like how the official language of every other state in the world is their majority cultural language.
All right, there is the first half of the first period of cross-examination. At this point in time, we invite Rawlins Academy to pose their questions to Fatima College.
Why is foreign trade being placed above cultural identity and current neocolonialism that affects the Caribbean today?
Because people will starve and go poor. Okay, so what we're seeing, right, is that your notion of national pride and national identity, it's kind of nice to have. We don't know why that's so important, why breaking down that stigma is more important than feeding people when they heavily rely on trade.
Also, what is more, when you were answering the cross-examination, you admitted yourself that there are other factors that go into cultural retention and cultural renewal. What we are saying is that we can have cultural renewal and cultural retention with linguistic programs and other stuff which exists outside official domains,
Such as UNESCO.
which can promote cultural retention without replacing colonial languages and, well, sending people into starvation and poverty and having elitism.
How do you contend with your point about tourism that the Caribbean should be expected to remain under the thumb of the tourist industry, which is highly damaging to the environment and highly damaging to the food chain, considering your points about starvation?
I think people going hungry or not being able to have jobs because the elites have taken all the jobs kind of trumps the environmental concern. Because when you think about it, you're talking about human life, you're talking about the access people have to live. Like, you can't outweigh that by saying that there's environmental concern.
And on top of this, what we are saying is that even with the environmental concerns of tourism, those concerns are not going to go away. It's just going to be privatized. And in a sense, that is the problem, because the way the tourism industry works in the Caribbean is that when people come, it's the interactions between the locals and the foreigners who come is what facilitates tourism. It's not necessarily like tourists can still come, we just won't be able to facilitate them as good.
Does keeping colonial languages not lock out more jobs for people who do not speak these languages and reinforce this class system that you've mentioned?
Can you repeat that question?
Does keeping colonial languages as the official language not lock out people who don't speak them out of high-paying jobs and enforce this class system that you mentioned?
Oh, right. Okay. Currently, right? And we mechanize this, whereas you didn't, right? I'm saying that in the Caribbean, they have large literacy rates. In many Indian states and in places like South Africa, they have high literacy. So they do actually have proficiency in these languages to an extent that they can at least understand them. We also watch movies in these languages where we clearly can understand these languages, right? So saying that you lock people out, that actually happens under your side because it becomes a privatized good. In a privatized good, people don't learn it in public education, so on and so forth. And then they actually get locked out by an elitist group.
All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Those were the three questions from both Rawlins and Fatima. That concludes the first period of cross-examination. At this point in time, we swing the debate back over to side proposition, where we invite their second speaker to extend the case for Rawlins Academy. That speaker, Clara Byford.
Good day. I'm Clara Byford and I'm the second speaker. I will now rebut some of the opposing arguments. They made the argument that money could be better spent elsewhere. In the Caribbean, people lack many things. Medicine. There is an education crisis. However, as we have stated, education is suffering because of neocolonialism and the fact that language is forced. upon people. How money can be spent better because education dictates the rest of people's lives. A language use can help people, not harm them. Secondly, I would like to move on to another point made, that colonial languages harm tourism, a major economic thing, we admit. But why? But we look at countries like Japan, South Korea, Thailand, that don't use English as official languages, but still attract millions of tourists and still have incredibly successful tourism sectors. Tourists do not read government documents. I would also like to reiterate that we define official public domains as domestic things. Governments can still speak to other countries in the chosen colonial languages, but in domestic domains, they can speak the languages of their choosing. And going back to regional multilingualism, it is important that it is multilingualism and it is regional because it must be chosen. And there is clear evidence on the states and where exactly there are. You are comparing, and we understand also that trade is a large part of the Caribbean's economic benefits. However, we also would like to say—
Point of information.
We were rejected. We would also like to say that the class divide also creates a problem. And when we say replace, we replace in the language hierarchy. This brings me to my first point. A language hierarchy in the Caribbean has created a class divide. A class divide which, when only 20% speak the language of power, democracy is a private club. High-status jobs, political participation, debate, jobs that earn money are all
Point of
required
information.
colonial language proficiency. Colonial languages create two Caribbeans, the one that rules and the one that serves.
Point of information.
Accepted.
Would you agree that heightening the accessibility to these colonial languages would fix this problem?
No, we would open the accessibility to these languages, but UNESCO states that it is easier to learn a second language if you are learning primary education in your first language, which for many people is not a colonial languages. Being taught in primary school in a language you do not understand, forced, cuts out creativity and critical thinking, as my first speaker has stated. Furthermore, back to my argument, rural and working class, often of a disadvantaged race, are systemically excluded because their education systems are not as good. Furthermore, this is a systemic racism and a direct legacy of enslavement that former colonizers created. They have created the social stigma that colonial languages are advanced and rich, and Indigenous or Creole are uneducated and poor. Wealthier families that can afford private colonial language schools today, because colonial language is already privatized and our model unprivatizes it, keeps families wealthy and reinforces privilege, whereas those in disadvantaged schools cannot learn a language, putting themselves at a disadvantage. The racial divide in the Caribbean, furthermore, is not accidental. It was created by former colonizers.
Point of information.
Accepted.
Public education accounts for 80% of students in the Caribbean and Africa. How do you contend with the fact that most of them would be locked out of colonial languages because the motion says replace, not incorporate?
We will replace colonial languages, but when we say replace, we replace it in the linguistic hierarchy. The linguistic hierarchy which places is former colonial languages above. It places them above. When we make them secondary, they can still be learned as secondary. When we define replace as to replace them in the language hierarchy. We are essentially swapping them. We are putting Creole languages, digital languages at the top. We are putting them in schools. We are putting them as the language people learn first. We are putting them as the first language, whereas we're putting colonial languages as secondary that can be learned as a second thing. Back to my point. Language has, in the Caribbean, become a class marker, not a communication tool. It's a way to keep Caribbean cultures at bay and continue systemic racism. My second point. Colonial languages are used to create dependence on former colonizers using news outlets and education. Colonial languages were not gifts, they were chains. They tie the Caribbean not only to a language, but to a method of control. In the Caribbean, you see curricula, language, universities, all Western viewed as above. You see them fuel a brain drain when people see Western as better, when people see the Western as better. This forced dependence also comes from news, Many news outlets in the Caribbean, including the BBC and France 24, which 50% of all people use, reinforce the idea that the cultures are worse. This reinforced makes it impossible. And when the Caribbean imports this information, it does not just import this news things. It does not just import intent, it imports the world views. Because this language forces them to learn the world through Western eyes. When people are introducing things. Now, to conclude, if your news, your textbooks, your universities, and your diplomacy all speak the colonizer's language, then the colonizer still speaks through you. The hierarchy only survives through the dominance of media and public life. Just to conclude, if you still speak your colonizer's language, independence is just a flag, not a reality.
And thank you very much. That was the second speaker from Rawlins Academy, Clara Byford. Ladies and gentlemen, we now extend the debate to the second speaker from Fatima College, that speaker, Adam Alves.
Good morning. Can I be heard?
Loud and clear, ready when you are.
Okay, I will begin in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind the audience today that the government has suggested we put one Creole over another, simply based on the popularity of a language in a region. This is fundamentally flawed, as it isolates other language groups and ignores the historical tensions within societies. Numerous studies and reports mirror this same logic. For example, UNESCO reports that language policies that privilege one language over others can marginalize communities and contribute to social tension and conflict, whilst the World Bank similarly acknowledges language policy exclusion as a key contributor to inequality, marginalization, and conflict, especially in diverse societies like our own. And history reflects the same thing. When one Creole is prioritized over another, there are devastating consequences. For example, let's look at a case which mirrors what the proposition is asking for. Sri Lanka, an ex-British colony which had their official language as English, replaced it with Sinhala. Although the majority language there were still large minorities of English and Tamil speakers. This language exclusion led to protests and riots which degraded into the Sri Lankan Civil War. Similar stories were seen in apartheid South Africa, Pakistan, Rwanda, India, and the list goes on. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a clear pattern here. Languages hold intense cultural meaning, and changing the one spoken in the public domain nearly always means conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, we on the opposition argue that colonial language is one of our greatest tools today because it grants access, not just locally, but on a global scale. And here I move on to my next point. Before I begin, allow me to stress the dangers of language decay, though. If this replacement were to happen, let's be clear about this. The public domain spans all schools and government institutions. If a people are not taught a language in school, the fluency is bound to drop. This is supported by second language attrition theory, which shows that reduced exposure, especially in the classroom, leads directly to reduced proficiency. And you cannot expect the average citizen to maintain their current level of fluency through private institutions alone. Allow me to begin with my first point. Replacing colonial languages reduces fluency and creates serious barriers to the digital world. The Benton Institute for Broadband acknowledged that language barriers were among the most concerning problems in digital equity today. These barriers persist because translational technology remains limited. Not to mention that, according to the Internet Society Foundation, only 10 languages represent 82% of written content online, with widely used colonial languages dominating a significant share of that. All this to say, All this to say that there is extremely limited content in Creole and indigenous languages online. By reducing fluency in globally used languages, we reduce our ability to access it meaningfully, limiting ourselves to our local content spheres. Internet access is becoming ubiquitous in the modern age, and we should aim to promote it, not stifle it. The United Nations has enshrined digital access as a fundamental human right, ladies and gents. Therefore, it cannot be justified to limit that access and force our communities into new struggles, excluding our communities from global discourse, e-commerce, academic resources, and even entertainment, all of which billions rely on daily, leaving 80% of people, as per the OECD, who get their education primarily from public institutions, hopeless, whilst those who can afford extra language tutoring can thrive with heightened access to the internet and global resources. Moreover, In this age of division, we deserve access to the best opportunities, not just locally, but globally. Developmental theory supports this. The UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, shows that expanding opportunities across life is essential for fair and successful societies. Allow me to show you the opportunities that colonial language gives us and what we will lose without it, beginning with tertiary education. If we observe the QS World University Rankings, over 80% of the world's top universities require proficiency in a colonial language to attend. Next, let's observe international advocacy. The mechanisms for change internationally operate solely with colonial languages. The UN operates on 6 languages, with the majority having colonial origins. Whilst UNESCO and the World Bank note that a lack of fluency in global/colonial languages directly holds candidates back, preventing them from gaining roles in global advocacy and decision makings in NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Ladies and gentlemen, let's pause. This debate is about reparations. So how are we supposed to gain them when we shut the public out of advocacy at the highest level? So then, let's analyze what would really happen when the government implements their policy. Simple. Those who cannot learn the language in the public domain are severely limited from their access to the internet, international job prospects, educational opportunities, and advocacy. These benefits of colonial language are left only to those with wealth and privilege who can afford language tutoring. Ladies and gentlemen, today, I would like to thank you all very much because we proudly oppose this motion. Thank you.
We say model they are secondary and they will learn today. People today.
All right, and thank you very much. At this point in time, ladies and gentlemen, we enter into our second period of cross-examination. The rules remain the same. However, this time, we will invite Rawlins Academy to pose their questions first.
We clearly state in our model that languages will be learned as secondary. Today, people do not have language proficiency. You are defending a system that does not work. Why?
Well, we clearly mechanize, right? That literacy in the Caribbean is upwards of 80%. The same trend is in urban Africa and India. You cited a 20% stat just saying people don't know this. I don't really know where that's from. But more or less what we're saying is that you cannot have secondary education in colonial languages because that's more incorporation in the public domain of education rather than replacement, right? And also we cited in Tanzania, this didn't work. When you have a dual system with already low educational resources, people won't learn English. And if you have it as a language subject, it's unlikely people will learn the language.
Indigenous languages and creoles, of many facing extinction are declining. Do you propose that we let them leave, keeping a language that was forced onto the Caribbean?
Not chosen.
Okay, yeah. That's a good question. Okay, so basically, there are other ways rather than replacing them in official public domains to maintain these languages. This looks like the Nigerian Oral History Documentation Project, which has enshrined oral history in Nigeria. The UNESCO, between 2022 and up to 2032, has labeled it a decade for action for indigenous languages. Why that's important is that there are other acts of how you can preserve these languages. In Singapore, they have mother tongue education. So people have already done incorporation rather than replacement. In South Africa, they're also trying to incorporate indigenous languages as something people learn as part of their curricula. So in the status quo, you already have a level of incorporation. Your replacement model, therefore, breaks that status quo and is saying, we don't want this in our public domain of education. You can't have your cake and eat it too.
Edith, question. Who does the current language system actually help? The elite, the majority, or the minority elite groups?
We do not just propose the current language system. What we do propose is that with our fiat, we are able to promote the accessibility to the colonial language so that everybody has the opportunities, as mentioned, to go into advocacy, international job opportunities, and political governance. Thank you.
And let's like to add to something. On top of this, implementing Creole and indigenous languages in official public domains, especially in the Caribbean, is not going to solve the issue of global advocacy because the United Nations, the European Union, they all cite issues of multilingualism. That's why the United Nations has 6 official languages, because they are large restraints in terms of global translation.
Also, we mentioned it'll enshrine an elite who just learned the language anyways.
All right, thank you very much. We now invite Fatima College to pose their 3 questions.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, cool. First question. If your policy is likely to raise food prices and impoverish citizens, how can breaking Western values and neocolonialism trump this? How can the ends justify the means?
Our policy, as we have explained, does not completely eliminate English spoken in the Caribbean. It is a slow process of 15 years, which our first speaker explained, and English would still be spoken with international trading partners, much how European nations such as Germany and France speak English when they are trading, even though English is not expected to be their official language.
Secondly, we see the problems with food, but that is a problem that can also be solved at the same time. It's important that the Caribbean, when the time comes, becomes independent on its own. It can trade, but it is also important that it has its own national identity. It's important that the languages are not simply the ones forced upon them. We are forgetting in this debate that the languages were not chosen, they were forced upon them in enslavement. We are forgetting that Creole and indigenous languages were suppressed. It is not simply the replacement. It is not simply that. It is the strengthening of a nation and solidifying independence. Next question.
You assert that learning a native language first helps learn a second language. Why does this matter when colonial languages are removed from public education and over time generations will lose it? As in, the motion says replace.
As we have asserted, replacement does not mean elimination. If you look at nations within Europe and within the Americas, the official language is not English, but that does not mean that English is lost. For example, the slow reform of the German education system has allowed generations of Germans to know both their cultural language, German, and the language of the world, English. The same can be seen with the United States of America. For example, Native Americans who learn early Navajo but still succeed in learning English.
Furthermore, if you look at smaller countries that are not so big on the trade in the world stage, such as Slovenia, they learn Slovenian in minor education and then proceed in later education to learn English. This foundation allows them to learn it better, as we have stated.
Good question. Your model highlights a democratic principle of people choosing the language they want to speak in these places. But wouldn't this lead to majority-minority tensions as seen in Sri Lanka with the Sahana Only Act, which led ultimately to a civil war?
As we've stated, we disagree. Our model allows regional multilingualism. Colonial languages cause more divides, the elite versus everyone else. This is a massive divide you see in the Caribbean. It does not create unity, as you are suggesting. Yeah.
Additionally, the nature of Sri Lanka's act was extremely divisive. Having a set official language does not mean that other languages are banned even from public life. For example, the official language of the United Kingdom is English, but if needed, translations can be accessed into almost any language. Placing one language as official does not mean that other languages will be rejected.
Wi-Fi drop.
I think our chair may have just lost his connection. So at this time, we will pause for 1 minute. And at the end of the 1 minute pause, we resume The reply speaker from team opposition, followed by that from team proposition. Your 1 minute pause begins now.
All right, and that is 1 minute elapsed. Ladies and gentlemen, we have only 2 speeches remaining in this first match of the semi-final. These 2 speakers will be trying their very best to convince us that their team has won this match and are deserving of a spot in the grand finals. To do so, for Fatima College, we invite their third and final speaker, David Scotland.
Can I be heard?
Yes, David, ready when you are.
Okay, I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, in their conquest to combat colonial influence, the proposition has ignored the true reality surrounding the use of colonial language within our societies and have done the opposite of what they intended, impeding the lives of the very citizens that they want to elevate. And we will not allow it. Allow me to begin in rebuttal by saying, first of all, this motion says replace. My first 2 speakers outline that when we lose access to these colonial languages in public domains, our proficiency decreases. Furthermore, the proposition crowned colonial languages as the kings of imperialism, but we call it a tool for colonial language, but we call it a tool for global access. David Crystal notes in English as a global language that Nordic countries which were never colonized still vastly use English in corporate governments and maintain high proficiency, showing that colonialism alone cannot be solely attributed to the adoption of colonial languages. Mr. Speaker, they also said that our languages have negative stigmas. And in rebuttal, I would like to say making a language official does not automatically remove stigmas and fix elitism on its own. A UNESCO report on Haiti's language inequality highlights that although Haitian Creole has been official for decades, French continues to dominate prestige and power. The opposition admitted that there are other factors. UNESCO's recognition of reggae explicitly highlights its contribution to international discourse on injustice, resistance, and love. And reggae globalized Jamaican Creole through cultural diffusion rather than stayed back to legal elevation. This shows that international acceptance can occur on a large scale outside of the official public domain. An official designation alone does not catalyze it and is not necessary to facilitate it. I would also like to highlight that there is a difference between an official language and a language being official in public domains. They are fundamentally different concepts. For example, in 2025, the Nigerian federal government announced the reversal of their mother tongue instruction policy, which was only in education or public domain, and it was stopped due to low retention rates and learning outcomes. And a statistical study revealed that this was due to official policy without external backing. But Mr. Speaker, the proposition also outlined that there are many native speakers who cannot speak colonial languages and are locked out of society. And we acknowledge this, but we say the solution is more access to colonial language, not less. We are not replacing the issue, and we are not rebutting the issue, but what we are saying is that we have an issue with the society we push our native speakers in. My first speaker outlined the issues of elitism which will arise if we replace colonial languages in official public spaces and leave the language to be monopolized by those who have apt resources to learn them. This is why we say we should include them into the society we already have by increasing their access instead of creating an entirely new one. And Mr. Speaker, allow me to remind the proposition what they will lose in the process if we go their model. My first speaker began by showing that removing colonial languages in the official public domain decreases proficiency, and then went on to show that since they are languages of the world, this is detrimental. Our first argument was about its impact on trade, where my first speaker definitively showed that a common language facilitates and increases trade between nations, and that the language barriers which will result from putting Creole in official public domains will impact trade and hence send people into poverty. That does not sound right to me. And as I highlighted before, our second argument was about elitism. My second speaker then reinforced the inevitable loss of colonial language if we replace it in official public domains. We use that premise to show how replacing colonial languages with Creole and indigenous languages will decrease our access to a variety of global amenities and opportunities. We prove this on the basis that many resources across the world are largely in colonial languages, and that without it, we lose our ability to interact with them. Our first example of this was the digital world, which has a vast majority of its material in colonial languages. This was then linked to the loss of the many advantages of the internet. We then showed that this rhetoric not only applies to the digital world, but diplomacy, international advocacy, and international education. And Mr. Speaker, we deride the moral bankruptcy of locking our citizens out of these opportunities. And Mr. Speaker, when a policy has the ability to send citizens into poverty and starvation, when inequality becomes the colonial word of the day for the elitists in post-colonial societies, when our citizens have reduced global access and opportunities, all in the hopes of a false pretense, we will always oppose the motion. Thank you.
And thank you very much, David Scotland. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now at the final speech in this debate. To conclude the case for for Rawlins Academy, we invite their third and final speaker, Edith Marshall.
Thank you. Can I be heard?
Loud and clear, Edith. Ready when you are.
Thank you. I would like to start my rebuttal with a quote from, from Jennifer Nelson on the slow destruction of language. To destroy a nation and a culture, you must destroy its language. That is the basis of our argument. The idea that the destruction and the frank rejection of indigenous languages is leading to a slow decay in their historical and cultural roots, which surely should not be allowed. We do not dispute the idea that English is a global language, but it seems that our opposition have completely ignored this slow development plan that we suggested. English would not be completely rejected. However, it would not be used in an official capacity. And I would like to use one of the opposition's examples to support our proposition. Our opposition mentioned the Nordic nations. Nordic nations do not use English in their official proceedings. They use their own languages. For example, Norway uses its own Norwegian bokmål. But many Norwegians still speak English. High levels of proficiency in a second language while having your own cultural language as your official language are not two distinct concepts, and this can be seen across the world. Therefore, we suggest that cultural languages should be the primary language of law, education, and healthcare. That does not mean that the Caribbean will be locked out of global trade. It simply means that, like the rest of the world, the Caribbean will be entitled to speak their cultural and historical languages while also interacting with the rest of the world. We would like to rebuke the idea of tourism and the idea that somehow it will be more challenging for tourists to access the Caribbean and to benefit the Caribbean economy if English is not an official language. Firstly, it is extremely unlikely that a tourist will be accessing official institutions such as the law courts or public education. Secondly, the comfort of tourists should not override a nation's right to its own language. For example, Germany still speaks German as their official language, but that does not mean that they do not take in English-speaking tourists for their economy. Nations like Japan have relatively low levels of fluent English within the general population, but they have taken millions of tourists from the United States and Europe. Finally, I would like to reinstate our point that the use of English as an official language solidifies the class divide. I would like to use a historical example for this. Prior to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the majority of the Russian elite spoke French. This was a true representation of their oppression of Russian speakers. The use of French blocked average everyday Russians from education, from universities, and from elite social circles. A similar trend can be seen today in the Caribbean, as people are not allowed to use their mother tongue in their everyday life. I am by no means suggesting that nobody in the Caribbean should be able to speak English, but I am suggesting, as are my team, that a cultural language should be what is spoken in an official capacity, and that is an extension of the right to access your own culture and your own history. Without the use of Indigenous and Creole languages, they will die out. And the death of a language is the death of a culture, which can be seen, for example, with Eastern Sami dialects, as these people are assimilated into Russian culture and Finnish culture, as their languages have been taken from them. So, I would like to finally reiterate our point that English is not being demonized, English is not being banned, nor is Spanish, French, or Portuguese, but instead the cultural language, Creole and Indigenous languages, will be the official language of public institutions such as schools, hospitals, and law courts. This does not mean that the Caribbean will be locked out of local trade, as many people in the Caribbean speak English, and it will be taught as a second language to future generations. So, the Caribbean will have the privilege that the rest of the world has, which is having access to a second language, such as English, while their primary cultural language remains intact, along with the history and cultural significance of that language. I would like to say thank you to the House for listening to our proposition, and thank you to our opposing team for their excellent debate.
And thank you very much to both teams, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes semifinals number 1 between Rawlins Academy and Fatima College. At this point in time, the judges are going to excuse themselves to a different space. We're going to discuss everything that we heard today. I'll return to you in short order with the results of this match. See you then.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this international reparation debate competition. This international reparation debate competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged.
We at the Rawlins debate team and we want to be a part of the Reparation debate competition.
I've always loved debating, but this debate has ignited a passion in me like no other. Being a part of the research team last year was such a wonderful experience I hope to relive.
This matters because this issue is a wrong that must be made right. This competition gives us an opportunity to immerse ourselves in this cultural experience.
Hey, aren't you the guy that stole my wallet?
Oh, excuse me.
You owe me an apology.
Listen, we must not seek to unpick the past, but rather focus on the future.
What?
As Dr. Eric Williams understood, Caribbean enslavement and indigenous genocide built up European wealth and left our region scarred and underdeveloped.
Here, take a look. We need reparations. It just makes sense.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this international reparation debate competition. This international reparation debate competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparation so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional / international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are, that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history. And having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much, all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state that teaching the history of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, or TTEA for short, does significantly more harm than good, not because of the topic, but because of the current pedagogical approach taken. Your average high schooler learns about the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans through a rigid, standardized curriculum. They are taught by a teacher who is expected to simply deliver information, often in a lecture format, and test students on their ability to memorize facts, years, and names. In this setting, students are not invited to engage critically with the material, ask difficult questions, or relate the content to their own lived experiences. Instead, they passively receive a version of history unable to truly process its relevance, impact, or emotional weight. Where is the opportunity to understand how this horror shaped the blood in our veins, the names we carry? There is none. Students memorize facts and regurgitate them on paper. But inside, the lesson lingers, that the history of the African diaspora is one of subjugation, and that their place in the world is to suffer and survive, not to lead, not to thrive. This is exactly what Paulo Freire, in his work The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, described as the banking method of education, where students are treated as empty accounts to be filled by the teacher. Freire believed this model was fundamentally oppressive because it prevents learners from becoming active participants in their own liberation. It discourages dialogue, reflection, and consciousness raising. This is what he calls conscientization. The teaching of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans today in many classrooms still follows this harmful pattern. When this topic is taught in a banking method that assumes dichotomy between human beings and the world they live in, Freire says an individual is a spectator rather than a recreator. This kind of teaching doesn't empower, it conditions students to fit into a world shaped by oppression rather than resist it. And that is why we say it does more harm than good, because it teaches history in a way that keeps students passive, not engaged. We learn about Oladoye Ekiano, we learn his name, we learn that he experienced this and he wrote an account, but do we open the book and study it and analyze it and discuss it with our teachers the way that Israeli schools discuss Elie Wiesel's Night of the Holocaust? The opposition says they want students to learn about the slave trade and the enslavement of a people. And of course, we all want all students across the world to have reverence for this grave and absolutely horrific period of history. And we do this with the intention that learning about it can empower them to challenge the lingering legacies of racism and inequality. However, defending the status quo, which our opposition seeks to uphold and claims offers us more good than harm, will not offer us this. This is not remembrance. This is not reverence. And when you trace the system back to its roots, you realize that this is not our system at all. Accepted.
The fact that students today are not listening about the brutality, but also about the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies, creating empowerment more than harm.
Right. Our issue is not with these topics being taught, but it is the way that they are taught and the way that they are emphasized with regards to all of the other things that are occurring within African history. To continue, our education system was inherited from Britain, a colonial power that had no interest in nurturing Caribbean identity or liberation. And what good can we expect from teaching this topic when we are continuing to do so in England's pedagogical approach? Even worse, as you mentioned, African history is taught in the Americas and Europe as though it began with slavery. From primary school, students are introduced to African people not through the glory of their kingdoms, their intellectual traditions, or their achievements, but through their chains. Why is it so hard for you to name a single black figure whose legacy is not defined by resistance to white oppression? Why is it that we teach about Toussaint and Nani, but not Imhotep, Mansa Musa, or Queen Nzinga in the same breath? This should be taught first. And compare this to how the Holocaust is taught in Israeli. This is taken from the Israeli Ministry of Education.
Point of information.
Declined. Children are introduced to the brilliance of their culture first, their thinkers, their faith, and their resilience before they are taught about genocide. Their oppression is contextualized within a legacy of strength, not as the first chapter. If that isn't a pedagogical problem, then what is? When slavery is taught primarily as a story of powerlessness and victimization, with the current banking method of pedagogy, it does more than inform. It deeply affects the psychological development of students, particularly those of the African diaspora. During adolescence, a critical time for identity formation, as described in Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, students are particularly vulnerable to internalizing messages about their race and their place in history. If the dominant narratives they encounter emphasize subjugation or this constant need to fight without also highlighting pre-colonial civilizations and agency, students may inherit a sense of trauma and inferiority. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's 1995 concept of stereotype threat shows that students underperform when they fear confirming negative stereotypes about their group, a common experience for Black students navigating a curriculum saturated with ancestral suffering. In classrooms where Black students only encounter these narratives and are rarely offered examples of greatness before colonial times, they are more likely to fear confirming negative stereotypes about Black intellectual inferiority. And yes, this study found that this did significantly reduce their academic performance. In contrast, we argue for emancipatory pedagogy, which views students as active co-creators of knowledge and encourages reflection, dialogue, and transformation. We want students to read and discuss the first accounts, and this should be a mandatory part of the curriculum, not an option. Additionally, students should be first met with pre-colonial history that showcases the richness and strength of Africans from various tribes and kingdoms before delving into the horrors of the slave trade. Through student-centered dialogic approaches, this topic becomes not a detached narrative of victimhood, but a pathway to critical consciousness where students develop an internal locus of control, a sense of pride, and the tools to challenge injustice. When classrooms prioritize empathy, voice, and critical inquiry over memorization, the teaching of the TTEA can become what Freire calls a practice of freedom, not oppression. We are fully justified in arguing that teaching the history of the TTEA causes more harm than good on the basis of the heavily flawed pedagogy. In parliamentary debate, motions like this are evaluated based on the status quo, meaning how things are actually occurring now. As such, the opposition cannot shift the debate by suggesting that in some ideal future it could be taught differently or argue on the basis of the principle. We are debating the present, and the burden is to defend the way that it is taught now. Thank you.
All protocols observed, the opposition remains resolute against the motion. This House believes that the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans causes more harm than good. We in the opposition agree that there are flaws in the method, but we argue that even in its current form, teaching this history does far more good than harm. We accept the definitions posited by the opposition with the exception of the word harm. Harm caused by the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans in this case is more like temporary discomfort that fosters long-term justice awareness and healing. The proposition burden is to prove that the act of teaching this history is inherently harmful, even when taught well, and that these harms are so deep and widespread that they outweigh all educational and social benefits. We must prove that the current approach generates more harm than good, and 2, the harm is not inherent to the method but as a result of poor implementation, and 3, that the teaching of enslaved Africans creates civic awareness, empathy, prevention of recurrence, and general social progress. The status quo, the history of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans is already being taught, but with growing care and impact. Students today are learning not just about the brutality, but also the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies of inequality. Yes, some schools get it wrong. Reform is being done for more inclusive, trauma-informed, and empowering education, making it the norm. Mr. Speaker, we are not for the current way of teaching this history. The motion didn't state the current way. We are for the best way of teaching this history. Allow me to rebut. And this best way is trauma-informed teaching. This would be training teachers to handle emotional topics with care, no graphic reenactment, use check-ins, and create safe spaces. This builds resilience instead of re-traumatizing students. And 2, balancing the story. Don't stop at brutality. Teach about African civilization, resistance leaders like Nani of the Maroons, and achievements of the African diaspora that restores pride and identity. 3, we would center real voices, use first-hand accounts, African scholars, and cultural sources to humanize the content and shift away from cold textbook trauma and link the past to the present, which will let students reflect through debate, which is already being done, and modern connections to racism and justice. This transforms discomfort into action and purpose, including Black educators. Involve Black voices in teaching is as authenticity, prevents tone deafness, and build trust in diverse classroom. This is credible as the RAN program has a similar approach, and it has proven to be working as it has a 94% increase in the racial unity and empowerment. Allow me to rebut the misconceptions provided by the government. The government stated that teaching of trafficking of enslaved African causes discomfort and psychological harm. But let me say that discomfort is not harm, Mr. Speaker. And the 2019 UNESCO states that students taught slavery alongside resistance have greater empathy and understanding of justice. And secondly, discomfort is necessary for growth and historical reckoning, just like the Holocaust education or genocide studies. They also stated that the current method does not include the history before slavery. But Mr. Speaker, Speaker, let me say that this is a big misconception. Most syllabi incorporates the history of the Africans before they were colonized. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Mansa Musa. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Songhai Empire. It is in the rationale also
Points of information
that the teachers should use discussions to actually engage the students. In today's debate, I will bring two substantive. One, the current methods build civic awareness, empathy, and critical thinking. And two, discomfort from learning is not the same as harm. It leads to empowerment. My second speaker will discuss justice and the prevention of repetition in the injustice, while my third speaker will prove why we remain supreme. Our first substantive is the harm lies in the method, not the content. My first warrant is balanced teaching that includes stories of resistance and survival, reduces emotional harm and builds empathy. When we emphasize both suffering and human dignity in the trafficking of enslaved Africans by teaching resistance, African agency and survival, we shift from trauma to empowerment. It does more harm than good because it builds pride, resilience, and understanding. For example, the Holocaust education isn't taught by showing only images of death camps. They come with stories of resistance, survival, and moral courage. It fosters pride, empathy, and moral courage instead of guilt or division. That's why balanced, trauma-informed teaching benefits are supreme. My second warrant is effective, safe teaching already exists and work. We're seeing programs like Facing History and Ourselves offer concrete evidence that teaching hard history can be both emotionally and safe, intellectually enriching. According to a 2021 RAND Corporation study, students in these programs which is a reform program by the way, show that 94% increase in civic agency, meaning they felt more empowered to take social action and reported deeper empathy, stronger historical understanding, and more open-minded attitude. And the fact that we're seeing this in real classroom, Mr. Speaker, proves that harm is not inherent to the topic. It's about how we design the curriculum and support teachers, and we are currently doing this now through reform. If we have models that work, and we do, then the moral burden shifts to improving delivery, not erasing the content. What my third warrant is suppressing this history causes more harm than good. Mr. Speaker, be aware that we're not talking just about the current history. We're talking about the teaching of the history overall, because that's what the mood says. In environments where slavery is ignored or downplayed, misinformation spreads like wildfire. Students grow up believing that slavery was minor, that racism is just a mere relic of the past, or that systemic inequality is simply an overreaction. This ignorance sustains real-world harm, and contrary to this, we're seeing that countries like Germany, who have faced their history head-on with regards to the Holocaust, show lower levels of historical denialism and far-right extremism than those that whitewash. The impact, it promotes social equity and activism, because when students learn this history accurately and empathetically, they become more socially aware, engaged, and ready to challenge injustice. And two, it empowers empathetic, informed citizens who are empowered to fight modern injustice. And three, it protects future generations from repeating injustice itself. My second substantive is silence enables racism to thrive. My first warrant is when schools avoid teaching slavery, they leave students with distorted or incomplete narratives. In the absence of formal education, when students are left to piece together understanding from biased media, peer opinions, or online misinformation, the result is a deeply distorted view of race and history. A 2018 SPLC report showed that only 8% of the US high school seniors could identify slavery as the primary cause of the Civil War. When students believe that slavery was a voluntary arrangement or that racism ended in 1865, it undermines every effort to promote justice and equality today. Silence gives racism plausible deniability that it suggests falsely that if we don't talk about injustice, it must not exist. The impact, it ensures future generations. And with that, the proposition momentarily rests.
400 years ago. 400 years ago, my people were dragged from their homes, tribes, families, placed on floating wood, and shipped across the Atlantic to what will be later described as the most inhumane act of all time. Cold, dark, uncomfortable, cannot describe the trip in ships where whips did not fail to miss. Injustice, rape and disgrace, blood rains, brute, force, ignorance, hate in their veins. Sweat and tears, labor revealed, produce from king fields, only for the esteemed. 400 years of eroding one's pride, culture, heritage, value. 400 years of the iron chain, stringing up, leaving bare. Oh, but they never cared. Why fight when you would be met with sharp blades? So don't you dare cry out in fear. Why not plan escape with the plaiting of one's hair? Oh, the drums, listen, dance, communicate. For tonight we fight a battle not even death could spare. Blue eyes, white skin, master said there's beauty within. But guess what? Black, brown, gold, royalty, reparations, we are owed. Them say hassa, but we say cassava. That's where we get the strength from to beat and conquer. For tonight, we're returning to Ghana. You may say, I'm a descendant of slaves because of the rich melanin that gushes from my pores. But I came to tell you tonight, I am not a slave. Rather the descendant of kings and queens. I am the embodiment of the divine. I do not chase, I align, I attract. What's meant for me already has my name on it. I am the personification of beauty, the expression of love, the creator of life, the acknowledgement of freedom. So go ahead, call me what you want, because when I die, bury me in the oceans where my ancestors jumped from the ships, because they knew death was better than bondage.
This is something that I wanted to discuss since Emancipation Day, but did you know that Britain only finished paying for slavery in 2015? Yes, 2015 as in 10 years ago. This fact was revealed in a since deleted tweet back on February 9, 2018 by the then Her Majesty's Treasury. In 1833, Britain borrowed 40% of its national budget, £20 million, to finance the Slavery Abolition Act. This act was the official end of British slavery and went into effect on August 1, 1834. The money that was borrowed was used to repay British slave masters for their quote-unquote loss of property. However, for the enslaved, there was no repayment and no form of compensation was offered. The amount that was borrowed, the £20 million, was equal to £2.2 billion in today's money. The since deleted tweet from Her Majesty's Treasury pointed out that the taxes paid by people today was used to repay the loan that paid the slave masters. This would mean that people from the Windrush generation and their descendants, people from Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago and other British colonies, would have helped to repay the loan taken out to pay the people who enslaved their ancestors. Using this video, I want to highlight that when people say that slavery was so long ago, 400 years ago, ancient history and we should get over it, we can see that it wasn't that long ago. If we look at a timeline of the history of Barbados, we can see that chattel slavery in Barbados lasted 207 years, whereas the time from emancipation in 1834 to today is only 191 years. So as a nation, we spent longer in slavery than we've spent free. I want you to think about that. Facts like these are why people have started a call for reparations, to correct an injustice done to us as a nation, a region, and a people. If you want to learn more about reparations and how you can be involved, click the link in my bio.
What you take, give it back. Stolen riches, give it back. My name, you changed that. Your hate, keep that. My land, where's that? Green pastures now flat. Your greed did that. My religion, you stopped that.
The African emancipation experience is a story of resistance and breakthrough, so that I could stand before you and speak to you because my ancestors paid the price for me. So when you look at me, see not just African beauty, but freedom in its entirety, where black is beautiful and freedom is opportunity, where people who look like me can be celebrated equally. Don't be distracted by my melanin. This skin that was once frowned upon is now flourishing. And if you know not to which I am speaking, then let the history lesson begin. To understand where we're going, we must first understand where we come from. So for some, this story begins at the bottom of a ship, forcefully migrated from the motherland as human cargo, an economical decision to work on a sugar plantation, and so slavery began. Beaten mercilessly, and regardless of sex, they were all treated as property. Can you imagine what it would be like to not be in control of oneself, to have your very life determined by somebody else? And if you want to talk about human rights violations, slavery is the definition. Punishment, imprisonment, torture, mutilation, sold without hesitation, separated from tribes to limit communication, and if you even harm an African ritual master could have your tongue for that. So on the plantation, it had none of that. We did what we were told, no questions asked. After all, slavery was an organized business and we were just labor. To work without receiving a dollar, branded and assigned Christian names didn't make it any better. But I am the prayers of my ancestors answered. A strong black African woman whose voice has the power to command even the boldest man, whose power comes from purpose, whose pain has inspired passion. So every African descendant walking confident continues to break the chains of a cycle. On August 1st, 1838, my generation was molded in hope, paid for in sacrifice, bought in tears. So when these heirs hear the words African emancipation, can we understand the dedication of our ancestors' contribution to civilization? Because these doorways to freedom that we walk through so gracefully was paid for with the life of your mummy's mummy. So I wear my African heritage proudly, as this poem speaks to who we are, who we were, and who we will be. And since I get to decide, I will take my African emancipation walk in stride. Stand with me. Side by side, black woman to black man, black boys to black girls. Let our stories be told with honor. Let the skin be celebrated in boldness, for in the end, this story was always destined for greatness. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just witnessed the first match in the semifinals of the 2026 staging of the International Reparation Debate competition. Now, we know the team that will be advancing automatically to the finals. The motion before us once more read, this House believes that post-colonial states should replace colonial languages with Creole and indigenous languages in official public domains. So how did the judges see this match? Well, we understood from proposition several key arguments including the fact that when we replace our Creole and colonial languages, when we replace our Creole and indigenous languages with colonial languages or replace it the other way around, what we objectively get is an improvement in governance. They tell us that what fundamentally happens is that individuals and people are more likely to want to engage in government. That barrier that exists is going to be breaking down. We get that in a large extent coming out of Aisha's case. We also understood the identity and culture is something that we definitely should be wanting to. We understood that colonial languages were used as a tool of suppression for our own identity and our own culture. And the adoption of that is, according to Team Rawlins, enforcing that kind of dependence, that kind of erosion of our culture. And it's something that we absolutely shouldn't be doing. We also understand that when we use our primary language, which Rawlins contained, is not the colonial language, but rather that Creole indigenous language that came about as a mixture of our African tongue or our tongue from different pieces from where we're from with the colonial languages, we get that unique indigenous language, and that is our primary language. Rawlins tells us that when we use that primary language, which is indigenous and Creole, as a primary mechanism for education, that leads to particularly good outcomes, such as a 30 to 50% increase in educational outcomes. And that's good. That's something that we want. Now, what did we hear instead from Team Fatima? Well, Team Fatima tells us that one, what's actually happening right now is that when we replace our colonial language with these indigenous Creole languages, that actually acts as a barrier to trade. They tell us in a very warranted and mechanized analysis, coming particularly from Alexander. And of course, the second speaker, Alexander, and the second speaker, Adam, yes, Kennedy and Adam, that what happens is that we actually get bad outcomes in terms of trade. They tell us that when the language of in the public domain is not English, that leads to bad outcomes because it becomes difficult and more difficult for us to engage in this kind of trade. Now, let's weigh this debate. On the question of identity and culture, the judges saw that Kennedy's pointing out that these were warrants that were not sufficiently mechanized were true. We think that the first speaker brought to us a really interesting idea of our identity and our culture and how we need to ensure that these Creole languages are in place so that we can get these kind of outcomes is really interesting, but they were not fully mechanized by you, Aisha. They were, however, more substantively mechanized by Clara in the second speech. Kennedy points it out. Kennedy says that, which is an interesting idea, and we see value in it, but you haven't mechanized it, you haven't explained it, you haven't warranted, you haven't shown us how replacing the Creole languages and the indigenous languages is going to lead to that kind of cultural retention. It's going to lead to all that sort of patriotism, that identity. Like, it's intuitive how it does, but in debates of this space, like, intuitiveness is not something that we really want to leave up the chance. We think, Clara, that you did a really good job of mechanizing that, but the question that relayed in the minds of the judges was that a little bit too late. We weigh that against Up's case of trade. Well, Up tells us that, well, we're going to have a breakdown in trade. Rawlins tells us that you're being a little bit too exaggerating right here. It's not going to be all that. Rawlins tells us, particularly coming out from Clara, that, well, actually, what's going to be happening is that you can still engage in trade. We have individuals who will speak in these public domains, the specific public domains that see trade happening in the natural tongue. Matter of fact, there are many countries, Rawlins tells us, that don't speak English as a primary language and they engage in trade nonetheless, and things are fine. We say that's a good response to the question of trade. We say the question of trade and it leading the replacing of English as a language is going to lead to abject poverty to be kind of an exaggeration. However, we think that that exaggeration, as the judges might have contended it, the warranting of it still leaves a concern in the minds of the judges about the difficulty that will elapse from this particular thing. So even if we think that, changing our primary language from Creole, from English to Creole, is not going to lead to like abject poverty, it still introduces a question that while it was undermined by Rawlins, the concern still stands. How difficult is it that to trade when it is that we lose a kind of fluency in the English language that Fatima so accurately contends or convincingly contends is what's going to happen? What does that mean when it is that we need to go to UNESCO or the United Nations or any of these other multilateral countries, institutions that use some sort of colonial language as their primary means of communication, and we lose the fluency in that? That concern still remains in the minds of the judges. And so the question of that, it stands. The question of elitism came up in the debate. We heard and understood that from Team Fatima, that what's going to actually happen is that there's going to be a sort of elitism when the colonial language, which is like super important and super popular, is going to be now reserved for the elite class. And that's bad. And they tell us that what that actually does, it entrenches that kind of elitism. They point out as well that when it is that these regional agencies accept one sort of Creole as their official language in the public domain, that comes to the detriment of particularly other minorities, and that has led to revolts and riots that existed in the past. Rawlins contends that there exists some sort of elitism already in the status quo as a result of the access to English language. And so it's like 6 of one, half dozen of the other. We think as well that the concern that comes in as much as it will no longer be, English will no longer be pushed through the public education system, which Rawlins contends about 80% of our individuals get their instruction, means that English is going to become a slightly more or significantly more, depending on the context of it, inaccessible thing, and that we'll get greater elitism coming out from Team Fatima College. So, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of this debate, weighing these arguments and many other arguments that came out, by a unanimous decision, the judges have concluded the scores. One team on 283 points, the other team on 289 points. In any other match, 283 could easily have been a winning score, but not in this one. The team that wins this match and will be advancing to the grand finals of this competition is the team in opposition, Fatima College. Congratulations.
I would just like to say that was a very stressful debate with us. Good job on the proposition side. Thanks for a good debate.
Yeah, congratulations. You guys did amazing, and we'll be back next year. So
it was lovely debating you. You guys were amazing.
Right. Thank you very much, Fatima College, our winners for this match. Rawlins Academy, your road is not yet over. You will be playing off in the 3rd place debate to see if you will secure for yourself a 3rd place finish. We want to extend commendations to Clara Byford from Rawlins Academy. You did exceptional in this debate. However, just beating you out by mere 2 points is the best debater from this match, from opposition, Kennedy Valley. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this first semifinals match. Join us in a few minutes where we will see the next semifinal match. That match will see Clarendon College in proposition face off against Montego Bay High School for Girls in opposition. Both schools from Jamaica. The motion. This house believes that the relative disinterest in reparation from Caribbean governments has significantly delayed the reparation movement. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful rest of your day.
Take care, everyone, and all the best. Congratulations again to Fatima College and keep on the amazing work, Rawlins Academy.
Indeed. And of course, just before we conclude, it would be absolutely remiss of me if I did not invite our guest judge, Dr. Chevy Eugene, to extend some commendations.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I just said, I don't know if you got me earlier on. So congratulations again, Fatima College, and congratulations to you as well, Rawlins Academy. To be honest, this was my favorite debate so far. We had some really interesting conversations behind the scene, but I'm proud of you both. And as I mentioned earlier on, it's really good to see how the conversations of reparations are taking place, not just in the Caribbean region, but also in the diaspora. And I'm really looking forward to see how things continue to unfold. So once again, to both groups of students, congratulations. You did extremely well. And I'm really not just impressed, but also inspired. Take care.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chevy Eugene. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we conclude this first semifinals round. See you in a few moments.